Something about this story doesn't make sense. There is a file, buried deep in the administrative records of the Soviet Union, cross-referenced in the footnotes of medical journals that few people ever read, that describes in the careful, neutral language of science, what happens to a human body when it is deliberately denied food. Not by accident. Not by war. But by design. By men in white coats holding clipboards, standing at the edges of a room, watching. The year was 1932. The place was the Soviet Union, in the grip of a famine so catastrophic that its death toll is still debated by historians today. And somewhere in the middle of that catastrophe, while millions of ordinary people were dying in fields and in villages, their bodies reduced to bone and shadow, a group of researchers decided that this was the perfect moment to conduct an experiment. To observe. To measure. To record, with scientific precision, exactly how human beings collapse when they are starved. What no one asks, what history has never quite forced itself to answer, is this: who gave them permission? And who were the people they chose to starve? To understand what happened in 1932, you have to understand the world that made it possible. The Soviet Union in the early 1930s was a country undergoing what its leaders called a great transformation. Under Joseph Stalin, the state had embarked on a program of forced collectivization, the seizure of private farmland across the vast stretches of the USSR, from Ukraine to Kazakhstan to the Volga River basin. Peasants who had farmed their own land for generations were told that the land now belonged to the collective. Their grain was to be delivered to the state. Their livestock was to be surrendered. And anyone who resisted, or who was suspected of hiding food, was branded an enemy of the people. The consequences were predictable in the way that only the very worst things in history are predictable in hindsight. By 1931, grain production had begun to fall dramatically. By 1932, it had collapsed. The state, however, continued to demand its quotas. Brigades of party officials moved through villages in Ukraine, in the northern Caucasus, in western Siberia, confiscating not just grain but any food they could find: beans, potatoes, dried vegetables, anything that could be eaten. In Ukraine, this period became known as the Holodomor. The death toll there alone has been estimated by modern historians at between 3, 5 and 7 million people. Across the broader Soviet Union, the total number of famine deaths between 1931 and 1933 is estimated at somewhere between 5 and 8 million. It was into this world, a world already steeped in mass starvation, that a group of Soviet scientists proposed their hunger experiments. The experiments themselves are not a secret. They appear, if you know where to look, in medical literature, in Soviet archival records, in the work of researchers who have spent years trying to piece together what happened in the laboratories and clinics of the early 1930s. The central figure in this story is a man named Nikolai Anichkov, a respected Soviet pathologist and medical researcher, a man who would go on to become one of the most decorated scientists in the history of the USSR. But in the early 1930s, Anichkov was working within a broader network of Soviet medical institutions that were exploring a particular question: what are the precise mechanisms by which the human body responds to starvation? How does it prioritize? What fails first? What lasts longest? And crucially, at what point does the damage become irreversible? These were not unreasonable scientific questions. Starvation had always been a feature of human history, and understanding its biology could, in principle, lead to better treatments for famine victims. That was the official justification. That was what appeared in the reports and the grant applications and the scientific papers that emerged from this period. But there is something strange, if you look closely at the details. The experiments were not conducted on animals, as most preliminary medical research of the era would have been. They were conducted on human beings. And the subjects of these experiments were not volunteers in the conventional sense of the word. Not people who had read a notice on a university bulletin board and signed their names in ink. They were, in the language of the records, institutionalized individuals. Prisoners. Patients in psychiatric hospitals. Orphans in state care. People, in other words, who had no ability to say no. The methodology, as described in surviving documents, was methodical. Subjects were placed on controlled diets of decreasing caloric value. Some received as few as 200 calories per day, a fraction of what a resting adult body requires simply to maintain its basic functions. Measurements were taken. Blood was drawn. Weights were recorded. The progression of physical symptoms was catalogued with the same detachment one might bring to a chemistry experiment. Edema, muscle wasting, cognitive deterioration, organ failure. Each stage was noted. Each stage was timed. Here is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Not because the basic facts are disputed, many of them are not, but because of what the official record chooses not to say. If you search the Soviet medical literature of the early 1930s, you will find a number of published studies on starvation physiology. Some are attributed to specific researchers. Others are attributed to institutions, the Leningrad Institute for the Advanced Training of Physicians, for instance, or the All-Union Institute of Experimental Medicine, founded in 1932 under Stalin's direct patronage. The Institute of Experimental Medicine was, at its establishment, the largest biomedical research center in the world. It had laboratories, clinics, and access, through the Soviet state, to a population of human subjects that no Western researcher could have legally obtained. The founding of that institute in 1932 is a fact worth sitting with for a moment. The same year that the famine was at its peak. The same year that millions of people were dying of starvation in the countryside. A vast new medical research institution was opened, specifically designed to study, among other things, the physiology of extreme deprivation. The timing may be coincidental. History is full of coincidences. But it is the kind of coincidence that a careful reader cannot easily set aside. What is also strange is the gap in the records. Soviet archives from this period are notoriously incomplete, not because documents were lost, but because documents were destroyed. The purges of the late 1930s consumed not just people but paper. Whole filing systems were cleared, whole research programs erased from the official record. When Soviet archives were partially opened to Western researchers in the 1990s, historians found enormous gaps in the documentation surrounding certain sensitive programs. The hunger experiments fall, in many cases, into those gaps. What survives are fragments. A reference in one paper to a study that cannot be located. A citation in a German medical journal from 1936 that quotes Soviet research on starvation metabolism without providing the full source document. A footnote in a post-war American medical review that mentions, almost in passing, that Soviet researchers had produced detailed physiological profiles of caloric restriction using controlled human subjects in the early 1930s, without elaborating further on who those subjects were or what happened to them after the study concluded. Historians who have studied this period have noted a pattern that extends beyond the Soviet Union, though the Soviet case may be its most extreme expression. The early 20th century was a period of tremendous enthusiasm for what was called scientific management of human populations. Eugenics programs operated openly in the United States, in Germany, in Sweden, in Canada. The idea that science could and should be used to study, classify, and ultimately improve the human species was not a fringe belief. It was mainstream academic thought, published in respected journals and taught in universities. Within this intellectual framework, the use of institutionalized populations, people who were already under state control, as research subjects was not considered morally problematic by many researchers of the era. It was considered efficient. The Soviet case added an additional layer. In a state where the individual had been subordinated entirely to the collective, the idea that a prisoner or an orphan might have rights that superseded the needs of scientific progress was ideologically incoherent. The state owned everything, including, in a meaningful sense, the bodies of those who depended on the state for their survival. Researchers who have examined the intersection of Soviet science and Soviet famine have noted that the hunger experiments of the early 1930s appear to represent not an aberration but an extension of existing institutional logic. If millions were already dying, and if that dying was, from the perspective of the state, simply an unfortunate consequence of historical progress, then studying the biological mechanics of that dying was not exploitation. It was, in the language of the era, making use of what was already available. That framing is chilling. But it appears in the surviving documentary record to be accurate. Not all of the evidence from this period comes from official records. Some of it comes from people. There is a memoir, published in the 1960s by a former employee of a Soviet medical institution in Leningrad, that describes in oblique terms experiments conducted on residents of a state orphanage in the early 1930s. The author, whose name was redacted from the published version at her own request, writes of children who were given restricted provisions as part of a study of nutritional requirements. She writes that the children were weighed each week, that some of them became very thin, that some of them did not recover. She does not use the word experiment. She calls it, with a careful euphemism of someone who lived through that era, an observation. There is also the testimony of a former prisoner, collected by a human rights organization in the late 1980s and published in a small circulation journal in 1991. The man, who had been held in a camp in the Urals in the early 1930s, describes being selected, along with a group of other prisoners, for what guards told them was a special dietary program. They were fed controlled amounts of food over a period of several months. A doctor visited them regularly. The doctor took notes. After several months, the program ended. The man believed that several of the others in his group had died during the study, though he could not be certain, because prisoners who disappeared were simply said to have been transferred. These testimonies are not definitive. Memory is fragile. Decades erode detail. And in a system that actively concealed what it was doing, the people who lived through it often had only fragments of understanding, a piece of what happened to them, seen from the inside, without context or explanation. But they are pieces. And pieces, arranged carefully, begin to suggest a shape. There are also the letters. Not many, but some. Letters from Soviet doctors to colleagues in other institutions, written in the early 1930s, discussing ongoing research. Some of these letters were preserved by accident, tucked inside unrelated files, overlooked during the purges. A few were smuggled out by researchers who emigrated in later decades. In these letters, references appear to studies of alimentary dystrophy, the Soviet medical term for starvation, conducted under controlled conditions. One letter, dated November 1932 and found in a private archive in Germany, mentions that the current famine conditions in the countryside had provided an unprecedented opportunity to study the progression of nutritional collapse in a large population. The author of the letter expresses, with apparent sincerity, his hope that the data collected would contribute to the advancement of medical science. He does not mention the people who were dying in order to provide that data. So here is where the story leaves us, in that uncomfortable place that history sometimes reaches, not at a conclusion, but at a set of questions that refuse to close. We know that Soviet scientists conducted hunger experiments on human subjects in the early 1930s. We know that those subjects were drawn from populations with no meaningful ability to consent: prisoners, orphans, psychiatric patients. We know that the experiments coincided with one of the worst famines in modern history, a famine that the Soviet state was actively concealing from the outside world. And we know that the documentary record has gaps, deliberate gaps, cleared by the same system that conducted the experiments. What we do not know, what the surviving evidence does not allow us to say with certainty, is the full scale of what occurred. How many people were subjected to these studies? How many of them survived? What happened to the data that was collected? Was it used? Was it useful? Was it quietly shared with other governments, in the way that scientific knowledge moved between states even during the Cold War? There is a particular question that historians of Soviet medicine have raised, and that has never been satisfactorily answered. After the Second World War, when Allied forces discovered the records of Nazi medical experiments at Nuremberg, the international medical community convened to establish the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical principles governing the use of human subjects in medical research. The principle of voluntary consent was placed at the center of that code. It was treated as a new standard, a modern standard, a line drawn in the aftermath of atrocity. But the Soviet hunger experiments predated Nuremberg by more than a decade. They were conducted by a state that was, at the time, an ally of the Western powers. And when the Nuremberg Code was written, the Soviet Union was a signatory. There is no evidence that anyone at Nuremberg raised the question of what had happened in the laboratories of Leningrad in 1932. Perhaps no one knew. Perhaps what was known was set aside for political reasons, in the complicated calculus of the early Cold War. Or perhaps the answer is simpler and stranger than that. Perhaps the story was simply allowed to fade, covered by the same silence that covers so much of what happened in the Soviet Union in those years. There is one more detail that lingers. In 1943, during the siege of Leningrad, when that city was surrounded by German forces for nearly 900 days and its population starved in the most literal and terrible sense, Soviet medical researchers produced a series of extraordinarily detailed clinical studies of starvation pathology. The studies were precise. They described the progression of nutritional collapse with an accuracy and a specificity that surprised Western medical researchers when they were eventually shared after the war. Some historians have attributed this precision to the suffering of the siege itself, to the terrible education that mass starvation provides to those who observe it closely. Others have quietly noted that the precision of those wartime studies resembles, in its methodological detail, the kind of knowledge that can only be gathered through controlled observation, through experiment, through the deliberate, measured, recorded study of what happens when a human being is denied the thing that keeps them alive. Whether those two things are connected, the experiments of 1932 and the clinical precision of 1943, is a question the documentary record does not answer. It is a question the documentary record may have been arranged to prevent us from asking. Perhaps it was nothing more than the terrible logic of a terrible time. Scientists doing what scientists do, in a system that had stripped away the ethical constraints that might otherwise have stopped them. Perhaps the gaps in the record are simply the ordinary entropy of history, documents lost to fire and flood and bureaucratic neglect, not to any deliberate act of concealment. Perhaps the children in that Leningrad orphanage, weighed each week by a doctor with a clipboard, were simply part of a study that seemed reasonable to the people who conducted it, within the framework of values that those people inhabited. Perhaps the prisoners in the Urals remember something that did not happen quite as they remember it. Perhaps the letters and the footnotes and the half-citations in foreign journals add up to less than they appear to. But here is what we know for certain. In 1932, while millions of people were dying of starvation across the Soviet countryside, other people, in laboratories, in clinics, in institutions, were being studied as they starved. We know this happened. What we do not know is everything that surrounded it. We do not know who authorized it. We do not know who was chosen and why. We do not know what happened to those who did not survive. We do not know what was done with the knowledge that was gathered from their suffering. History is full of things we do not know. Most of them stay unknown simply because no one looked closely enough. But some things stay unknown because someone at some point decided that they should. And the difference between those two kinds of not knowing, the innocent and the deliberate, is the thing that keeps certain stories alive, even when every official record insists they have already been closed. Somewhere in an archive, perhaps in Moscow, perhaps in a collection that has not yet been fully catalogued, there may be a folder. Inside it, perhaps, are papers, data tables, measurement logs, clinical observations written in the careful hand of a researcher who believed, with complete sincerity, that what he was doing would someday benefit humanity. Perhaps those papers have already been destroyed. Perhaps they have simply not yet been found. And perhaps when they are found, if they are found, they will tell us something we are not yet ready to hear. About what science is willing to do when it believes no one is watching. About what power is willing to sanction when it believes the costs fall only on those who cannot object. About what gets buried, and what survives the burial, and what we owe to the people whose lives were measured and recorded and then quietly forgotten. They deserved better than to become data points. They deserved better than to be catalogued and then erased. They deserve, at minimum, to be remembered. Even if the only way we can remember them is by asking, very carefully, the questions that were never supposed to be asked.